Welcome back to the Hall H Show podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Nabus. On the last episode, episode 56, we learned a bit about Arlen Schumer, comic book historian, author, illustrator, and graphic designer from my interview with him that was recorded at Palm Springs Comic-Con 2017. On this episode, recorded at San Diego Comic-Con 2018, we learn more about his three pop culture children, Bruce Springsteen, the Twilight Zone, and the Silver Age of comic books. We also talk about his argument of the racism of Black Panther's mask, auteur theory of comics as it pertains to Jack Kirby and other artists like Steve Ditko, who should have their rightful creative credit attributed to them, self-sacrifice, and what it is to be a man. This is one powerful and moving podcast as Arlen got real and vulnerable with me, just like his idol, Bruce Springsteen, was with him. And I love him for it. I'll always remember this day since not only did we do a 2.5-hour podcast where he schooled me on comics and pop culture, but we spent another couple of hours at dinner afterward where he continued to school me and gave me guidance on how to get to the next level personally and professionally. There won't be my typical closing at the end of this episode, so please follow Arlen at arlenschumer.com, popcultureman.com, and check out the video of his visual lecture, The Origins of Jack Kirby's Black Panther, on the post for episode 57 at hallh.com or our Arlen Schumer playlist on our YouTube channel. Peace, cheers, and please experience Arlen's brilliance for yourself if you happen to come across one of his visual lectures at a convention you go to. And thank you, Arlen, for your brotherhood. Enjoy. Hey, fellow nerds and geeks, welcome to the Hall H Show podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Nabus, and on this episode, we are at San Diego Comic-Con 2018, and I'm joined by somebody who's a kindred spirit when it comes to graphic design and somebody who I consider an authority when it comes to comic book history, and he's also a bit of a big brother that I look up to. So I appreciate Mr. Arlen Schumer coming on the show. Welcome to the show, Arlen.
Hey, Aaron, Thanks for having me, and it's great to be here as always. And thanks for those kudos. By the way, you left out that I'm also a member of the Society of Illustrators. Hello.
Well, I knew you'd bring it up yourself, so, you know.
Oh, thanks a lot. I'm done tooting my own horn. You know, other people got to blow my horn for once.
So, yeah, the reason we wanted to have you on the show is because, A, I don't see you enough. And
we're on two different coasts.
Yeah,
hello.
Exactly. And you are presenting a few panels, or you're going to be in a few panels here in San Diego. You got the Jack Kirby panel.
Well, the tribute panel. Mark Evanier, annual panel. He's been running it, I think, for as long as San Diego Comic-Con's been around.
Right.
He was one of the early San Diego originators, 1970. So he's every Sunday morning, 10 a.m. to 11:30. He runs a Kirby tribute panel, which he has every year. Different guests, some repeating guests like Kirby's estate lawyer, members of Kirby's family, great artists that are influenced by Kirby, writers, editors, everybody. And I've known Mark Evanier as a fan. He worked for Marvel Mania in 1969-70 when I was a kid, and getting those posters in that magazine. And then my first year at San Diego was 92, and that's probably when I met Mark in person. So we go back a long way. So finally, I've only done Kirby projects for 10 years, but I guess he must have run out of other guests, and I guess he's scraping the bottom of the barrel, and he asked me. Well, I love you, Mark, if you're listening. And, I hope you're listening, but I also hope you're not listening.
Right. And of course, Kirby is always awesome at panels, but even more appropriate because of the 100th anniversary of Jack Kirby.
Well, that was last year.
Right.
And that was my lecture last year that we had an interview on Hall H. But this year, because of the timing of the Black Panther movie coming out earlier in 2018, the Comic-Con likes lectures and panels that are based on the year and if there's an anniversary. So I pitched them a lecture I put together called The Origin of Jack Kirby's Black Panther, which actually I'll be doing at the very end of the Comic-Con at 4 p.m. They've usually given me prime time on Saturday, but this time I'm at the end of the day on Sunday. But I've talked to people and they said, Arlen, sometimes they save good panels for the end of the show so people don't leave. But the nice thing about now being on the Kirby tribute panel Sunday morning is I get to promote the Black Panther lecture to the exact audience that I want to come at the end of Sunday. So tomorrow is like a real good bookend day for me. So I'm actually glad it all worked out that I'm doing both things on Sunday.
I'm glad. I mean, it's going to end San Diego Comic-Con with a blast.
You know, in my promotion, I'm saying San Diego Comic-Con saved the best for last. And I'll back that up if you come see me.
Yeah, I mean, your visual lectures are definitely something that everybody should experience.
And, you know, I've been trying to brand them, to use a current hot word, as visual lectures, because the word lecture has such a negative, pejorative connotation, you know, like you're being lectured to.
Right.
But it is what I do, and yet because what I do is so visual at the same time, I mean, in a 45-minute talk, I could be showing you up to 700 images, yet you don't realize you're being shown 700 images because I literally have an image on screen and dissolving to the next on almost every sentence I speak. So there's always something visual, just like comics, words and pictures. So I thought, how can I brand what I do? There's really no other word for lecture, because if you say presentation, that could be anything. That could be an exhibit of paintings. So I'm stuck with the word lecture, but then as a graphic designer, I realized, wow, the word visual, which is what I do, they share the letter L. So it's a little clunky and awkward, but I try to describe what I do as visual lectures.
Mm-hmm. And
but they're pretty verbal at the same time. Trust me. If you've been you've been listening to me so far. Hello.
And is there any way that maybe you can sort of tease it a little bit? I mean, the significance of Jack Kirby, and you can go to the.
What most comic fans don't realize, and forget about the general public that is turned on to Black Panther because of the incredible movie that was made, but Jack Kirby created the Black Panther. And we'll talk about Stan Lee's involvement in a minute, but we have a surviving sketch of Kirby's original concept for the Black Panther, which had to be around 1965, let's say, because the first Black Panther appears in FF 52 or whatever, 53, in the spring of 66, which means he had to write and draw it probably in the winter of 65, which means maybe this preliminary sketch, let's say, is sometime in 65. And it's of a black superhero. He looks like a black Superman. Not that the costume looks like Superman, but he's a fully exposed black man. And he's standing in the Superman position, arms akimbo, I think it's called. And it looks like Obama as a superhero. Maybe, you know, steroided out a little, like a Kirby figure. And he has a costume that's not like anything like the Black Panther, but it's actually got a little bit Captain Marvel to it, with that kind of weird Captain Marvel cape, the Captain Marvel from the 40s. So, and it was called the Coal Tiger, Coal. Now, why did Kirby choose the Coal Tiger? Well, when you think of a tiger, you think of an orange striped tiger. Now, maybe a term for a panther from Africa might have been, it's a coal tiger, meaning a coal black tiger. But because in this country, a coal black, like that famous Disney animated cartoon that's considered now racist by our modern standards, Coal Black and the Sebben, Sebben, Sebben dwarfs. You know, this was back when, you know, racism like that was acceptable, of course. Mm-hmm. That's when Eisner's doing Ebony, the sidekick to the Spirit, as a fat-lipped Negro caricature, a Step and Fetch It, and Eisner's a mensch, and yet the unconscious racism of the day, that was acceptable. So I don't think Coal Tiger is racist, but people are trying to say now, oh, isn't Coal Tiger a little racist? No, it's how you would describe a Black Panther, different from an orange striped tiger. The point is how do we get from an exposed black man, fully faced exposed like Superman, to the fully masked Black Panther printed in 1966 when we have, also as forensic comic evidence, a rejected cover of the first Black Panther FF issue where you see the Black Panther with a half mask like Batman. Now, if you know your history, what was America like in 1964, 5, 6? Gee, going through the civil rights movement?
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my lecture, I talk about Kirby had a Jewish humanist consciousness, forged from his background, like all the great mid-century American Jews that went to World War II and came back and cathartically relived put their war experience. J.D. Salinger, all those guys, Norman Mailer. And Kirby worked with Patton. And there was an African-American tank regiment called the Black Panthers. Now, we'll talk about the name change, but the point is, how did we get from a fully exposed black man to a fully masked black man? According to urban legend, because the problem with comics history, most everybody's dead now, and there's no surviving paperwork, but the prevailing wisdom is that the Southern distributors of Marvel Comics, Marvel felt, whether it's Lee, Goodman made all the decisions. Goodman probably felt that 1966 Southern distributors would not accept a black superhero, on the cover at least. Let him discover that he's black on the inside, which we did. But we went from a fully exposed black man to a half-black man. That wasn't good enough. Now, here's the problem so in my lecture, visual lecture, I go into that. I think Kirby was moved by the civil rights movement, which, if you know about the civil rights movement, was aided and abetted both philosophically and financially by Jews who identified with the black struggle because of their struggle as a people, whether you go back to the Egyptians or the Nazis or the Russian Cossacks in between and every other Jewish massacre throughout Christian history, which is all subject of another podcast. But I think Kirby was aware, just like the death of President Kennedy made him want to bring Captain America back. I think Kirby saw what was happening. It was in the news, the death of the civil rights workers in 64, the Watts riots in 65. And Kirby, then there's a quote. I suddenly realized I had thousands of comic book readers and yet thousands of black comic readers, and yet I didn't have a black superhero, or words to that effect. And that comes from an interview with him.
Right.
Now, how do we get from the coal tiger, fully exposed black man, to the Black Panther? Again, this gets into a whole nother podcast discussion, but everybody wants to bend over backwards and claim Stan Lee created the Black Panther. Stan Lee says he created the Black Panther, like everything else, and Kirby drew it up. Well, not when we have the forensic evidence of the coal tiger. But yes, we have the name change. Did Lee suggest it? Did Goodman suggest it? Well, we know that the Black Panther Party was formed 6 months after the Black Panther appears. And of course, they didn't give Kirby the credit, because I don't think it was cool for black people in 66 to attribute the name of their new radical organization to a white Jew. Maybe. I don't know.
Right.
But they did say, we got the name from a 1964 Southern voting rights organization, Alabama, who in turn got it from Clark Atlanta University. The sports mascot was the Panthers, not the Black Panthers, just the Panthers. But what is the best forensic evidence? Kirby fought in World War II. Was he aware of a black regiment? Maybe. So where did the Black Panther name come from? I'm stunned and disgusted by how many comic book fans who should know better bend over backwards to give Lee the credit for anything from naming the Black Panther to creating him. And this gets into the larger Lee Kirby issue. There is no forensic comic book evidence that exists to support that Stan Lee could have created a character or a story of lasting artistic worth before 1961, when he had a 20-year career, and after 1970. And yet, there's a mountain of forensic comic evidence on Kirby's side and Ditko that they did write and create characters and stories of lasting artistic worth, which is how we measure art before 1961 and after 1970. And yet, comic book so-called historians and fans who should maybe know better, but they don't know, because people don't really know this. They've accepted the Lee line for 50 years now. And they bend over backwards to somehow they want to give Lee credit. So to them, maybe Kirby created the Bible. But Lee named him. Lee wrote the story. No, he didn't. That's Kurt. So I do a visual lecture called The Origin of Jack Kirby's Black Panther. And by the way, Roy Thomas, when he published it, in verbal visual form in an issue of Alter Ego in 2013, he had to write an editorial disclaiming the article that he was publishing.
Oh, wow.
Because he doesn't agree with me. And after that, he broke off his multi-year relationship with me.
Oh, wow.
Now, I did a thing called the auteur theory of comics in 2011, which is all about how, just like in film, comics are 75 years behind film criticism. No matter what an artist draws in comics, whether he works from a full script like Alan Moore, 25 pages for one panel, or whether it's a phone call from Stan Lee to Jack Kirby saying, hey, Jack, how about have the FF fight a really big villain? And what does Kirby do? Goes to his Long Island basement and creates the Galactus Silver Surfer trilogy. Oh, but guess what it says in the credits? Written by Stan Lee. So layman and comic fans thinks written by means created by.
Got it.
It doesn't say by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. It says written by, drawn by. So here we have forensic comic evidence of the Coal Tiger. Here we have forensic comic evidence of a Black Panther Legion in World War II that Kirby fought in. If this were a case being presented before a jury, those are my exhibits. And what is on Stanley's side? Nothing. Zero. Except his own words saying he created it in all of his published things since 1974's The Origin of Marvel Comics. And if I'm getting a little angry, it's because, I believe Stan Lee committed what I call the art crime of the 20th century. Now, that might sound grandiose, but guess what? He goes around and his fans go around claiming he created all these things. You add up the sum total of what those creations are worth. Now, even though Stan Lee doesn't make the money because he was a company man, that's not the point. The point is he stole creative credit of a chunk of 20th century mythology from another human being who died in 1994. I saw Kirby here in the summer of 93 before he died. He was 77. Now, Paul McCartney is 77 and still rocking. 77 is the new 60. Kirby looked like a frail old man on death's door, and he died 6 months later. He died knowing he was cheated by Lee. He died having to watch the Lee shit show parade around like the emperor wears no clothes for the last 40 years of his life. And even though the Kirby estate settled, and God bless them, they took the money instead of letting it go to the Supreme Court, if you know that story. But I don't necessarily blame them. But all of what's happening with Kirby now, the fact that Ava DuVernay is going to make the New Gods movie, thank God, pun intended,
right?
Because Stan Lee has nothing to do with that, officially. So maybe Kirby will finally get his due. But in terms of the Marvel stuff, he'll never get his due. In fact, I believe when Lee passes, whenever that is, and only the good die young, and he's outlived everybody. He just outlived Ditko. Disney will embalm him like they've embalmed Disney himself as the great creator. And Kirby will be a footnote because they paid off the Kirby estate. They don't have to honor Kirby. Their money, they've bet on Lee and all those cameos and all the goodwill, and people call him Stan. They don't call him Lee. Because it's all part of the Merry Marvel Marching Society, True Believers, Uncle Stan, the Merry Bullpen, which was all a fiction. And God bless, that's Lee's 50% of the success of Marvel that I give him. He was a great promoter and showman. He wrote snappy dialogue, but he didn't write the story. He didn't create those characters. There's no forensic comic evidence to support that. But I give Lee his 50% for his editing, his writing, the dialogue, his salesmanship. None of that has anything to do. You know, I tell people, Marvel Comics. Kirby and Ditko created the comics. Stan Lee created the Marvel.
Got it.
And nothing's wrong with that. That's your 50%, Stan. But guess what? Lee's not happy with 50%. Neither are his fans. And I find that sad. Sorry to end on a little depressing note. Other than that, life's great. What else do you want to? Enough about Lee and Kirby. What about me?
Let's talk about your other visual lectures that you have in the pipeline.
So, if you can't see me in San Diego, 2 days later, I go up to Los Angeles And for the Society of Illustrators Los Angeles, the last couple of years, I've been giving them a kind of a double header lecture in one night where I present what I did at San Diego for all the people in LA that can't make it to San Diego. And there's plenty, as you know, San Diego sells out in 2 minutes.
Sure.
And I'm adding another lecture that I also pitched to, I pitched 3 lectures about the year 2018 to San Diego Comic-Con. And of course, I'm glad they can only pick one. And that's all I need to get my ticket in here. And they chose the Black Panther. My other 2 lectures that they did not choose, and I knew they would choose the Black Panther because it is the most timely.
It's the most relevant.
Yeah. But the other 2 are more for sort of comic book people. One of them is on the 50th anniversary of Neil Adams debuting his Batman, which people don't realize because, again, this is 50 years ago, but I was there. Neil Adams, in one issue in the summer of 68, 3 months after the TV show was canceled, gives us the Dark Knight of today, period, in one issue. A story that he didn't write, Bob Haney wrote, but he auteured, meaning he took it and made it his. And that's what a comic artist does. And everything we love about Batman now, the Dark Knight, the mysterious, whatever you want to call what you know of Batman. Frank Miller was my age when this issue came out. Mm-hmm. It was the one, and it was Batman meeting Deadman, who was the character that made Neil's bones. Deadman was his, like the way Walt Simonson broke on the scene with Manhunter in 73. Mm-hmm. Deadman was that for Neil Adams. So what does he do? He wants to draw Batman. So he convinces the editor Brave and Bold, which was doing Batman teams up drawn by Ross Andrew, the polar opposite of Neil Adams. And Neil says, listen, Deadman, I'm already drawing. Let me team up Deadman with Batman. And because of that, in one issue, and get that issue, track it down, pun intended, because it's called Track of the Hook. And it's from 1968. And I remember I was a Batman fan. I hated the TV show. I hated the campy character. And when it was finally off the air, all of us Batman fans were like, thank God that's over. And then this newcomer Neil Adams, who had been blowing our mind with Deadman, every issue was this phantasmagoria of art, storytelling, cinematic camera angles, emotion. All of a sudden, he applies that to Batman, and we get not only the bat in Batman, as we've never seen him, his cape, like we know of Batman today. You think of the cape as almost a living object. Neil Adams instituted that in one issue. Mm-hmm. And he gives us the man in Batman because the realism of Deadman and Neil's realistic style was finally applied to Batman. And all of a sudden, fans are seeing Batman like we've never seen him before. And that's why we have the Batman of today. So that was a whole visual lecture. And then my last one was about the year 1968, the 50th anniversary. Because as anybody that knows American history knows 68 was the most turbulent year, probably in the century for America. All the assassinations, the Vietnam War, all the social upheaval. But in the arts, not only in, let's say, music, the Beatles charted their greatest single with Hey Jude. In film, you had the greatest movie ever made, 2001: A Space Odyssey. But what was happening in comics? It might, or it should be considered maybe the single greatest year of comic book history. And why? Because so many living legend artists did much of their greatest career work in that year. And when you examine it, and I take 18 issues, because that's how many groundbreaking issues there were by all, it was like 18 issues by about a dozen artists. And they're the usual suspects. Neil Adams, Jack Kirby, not Carmine Infantino, Gil Kane, John Buscema, Jim Steranko, Joe Kubert. Joe Kubert does Enemy Ace in 68. That might be his single greatest body of artistic work. IDW just recently did an Enemy Ace artist edition. If you don't have it, get it. Now, Kubert went on, like a lot of these guys, they did great work after 68, of course, but in 68, you had Steranko doing S.H.I.E.L.D., his greatest works. You had Neil Adams reinventing Batman and doing Deadman. And then later in 68, starts doing the X-Men for Marvel. and gives you the Marvel of the X-Men of today. Or maybe that started in 69, I'm sorry. But in 68, you have Gil Kane doing one of the first black and white graphic novels called Savage, based on a kind of Dirty Harry character that influenced the creation of Dirty Harry. That comes out in 68. Ditko gives us the Creeper, Hawk and Dove, that are ongoing DC characters now. It's funny, with Ditko just passing, I tell people, in order to show the Hawk and Dove and the Creeper, you have to show a little bit about Spider-Man and why he quit Marvel and went to DC to give them those creations. Well, to people that come see me on Tuesday night in LA, it's almost like a mini Ditko retrospective eulogy, because I give you like a mini Ditko, because like I said, I kind of show a little of Spider-Man, Doctor Strange, and how they influenced the Creeper and the Hawk and Dove, and how the Hawk and Dove was about what was happening in 68. Mm-hmm. So it ends up being a little mini Ditko retrospective, which I'm kind of is a happy accident, as sad as I am about Ditko's passing. And then, God, there's probably artists I can't. Nick Cardy did Batlash, which was the sensitive cowboy before Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. Again, I got to stop and think, but the first Spider-Man magazine came out, which was a forerunner of Marvel's magazines. And for us fans of the time to see comics in a magazine format, yeah, there was creepy and eerie, but that was monsters and horror. This was superheroes in a magazine format. So that was groundbreaking. And it was a John Romita, it was his sketch, but painted by a magazine illustrator. Now, we live in an age of Alex Ross and painted superheroes. But in 1968, seeing Spider-Man painted was revelatory. So that was kind of impactful in 68. So that's what my lecture is about, my visual lecture. And I'll be debuting that in LA.
Cool. And one thing I admire about you is your mission to sort of give the respect of, the
artists.
Yeah, the artists.
How ironic.
Yeah.
It's a visual medium. Yes, there's words, of course, but like movies are primarily a visual medium. But you need a great screenplay, of course. Shakespeare said the play is the thing. But my whole auteur theory of comics is based on the fact that it doesn't matter whether the artist was told what to draw or whether, like I said, whether it's a phone conversation, a synopsis. You give 10 different artists the same exact script, whether it's a full old school DC script where the writer told the artist, panel 1, character comes through a door. Panel 2, he gets hit in the face. You give those instructions to 10 comic artists, guess what? You're going to get 10 different versions of a guy coming through a doorway getting punched in the face. That's why it's the auteur theory of comics, because no matter what the script was, it's how the artist interprets it. And that is de facto co-creation. So yeah, how ironic. I grew up as an artist because of comics, like a whole generation did. And yet, the writer, because it says written by first and drawn by second, the writer subconsciously is elevated above the artist. In music, why do they always give the lyrics first? I used to be an Elton John fan. It always said lyrics by Bernie Taupin, music by Elton John. Do you know who cared about the lyrics back in the day? Do you know they actually did a song to test the fact that nobody gave a shit about the lyrics? Bernie Taupin in 1974 writes a song called Solar Prestige A Gammon for the Caribou album. It's all nonsense words because he would mail them to Elton John. They never worked together. Elton John would get these lyrics in the mail, sit down at the piano and create those songs. So they actually did a song in which the lyrics meant jack shit on purpose. And yet, lyrics by Bernie Taupin, music by... So subconsciously, the lay public and therefore comic fans, immediately the writer is put above. Now, I worked in advertising. I was both a art director and a copywriter because I could write my own stuff. But I knew what the situation was in ad agencies. The account people who were in charge of the money from the client, who did they respect more, the copywriter or the art director? Okay. Even though supposedly in the age of modern advertising, they're a team, they work together. In old advertising, the copywriter, just like in comics, wrote the ad, and the art director figured out how to visualize it. But ever since the 60s revolution, just like the Marvel method of comics, art directors can now come up with ideas, and, an ad is both visual and verbal, blah, 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 blah. But who do the account executives respect more? The copywriter. Why? He's a master of words. He's smarter. The artist is still stereotyped. He's the guy with no social skills. He can draw pretty pictures, but can he not be in the meeting with the client? Even though they're paid the same as copywriters, conceptually and mentally, unconsciously even, the writer is elevated above the artist. Yet, we live in a visual society, a visual world. 90% of our knowledge comes through our eyes. And yet, the writer is still put above the artist in the society. And in comics, like I said, in which the artist tells the story, no matter whether, all those Dick Sprang Batman stories, they were all written old school by writers in New York. Sprang lived in Arizona. Panel 1, page 1, Batman and Robin, are in a time machine, blah, 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 blah. Now, why can you tell a Dick Sprang story apart from every other Batman hack that was ghosting Bob Kane? How come when you see a Dick Sprang story, it's a Dick Sprang story, even though he didn't write it? Because the way he told the story. Batman's up on a roller coaster. Dick Sprang drew every wooden slat in a 3-inch panel. Looking down, looking up at Batman, this little tiny figure at the top of the roller coaster. He took the time in a panel this big that he was probably getting paid $20 for. He took the time to draw every wooden slat. Now, we as readers, we don't articulate it, but that is Dick Sprang, the auteur, saying the script is telling me to make you feel Batman is in danger of his life being thrown off the roller coaster by the villain. You give that to 10 different artists. 9 of them won't want to draw every slat. They'll figure out another way to draw it that's easier. But Dick Sprang auteured it to be a Dick Sprang story. What is Dick Sprang known for? Giant props, dynamic angles. He auteured every story he drew. But he didn't write a word. Neither did Howard Hawks or John Ford or the great movie directors who were declared auteurs by the French film critics in the 50s. We are 50 years behind, 75 years behind French film critics. And I'm the only one. And by the way, by declaring that, I lost friendships with writers. Roy Thomas, like I said, I can name writers out there that I was once friends with that I'm literally no longer friends with. And not because of anything I did. They broke off because they, in a sense, represent Stan Lee. And primarily my auteur theory of comics was in defense of Kirby versus Lee. So a big chunk of my verbal visual essay and my written essay that you can find online, just look up Auteur Theory of Comics by Arlen Schumer. But yeah, so I've paid the price for standing up for Kirby and Ditko and all comic artists who need to be treated as de facto co-creators, whether they're paid freelancers, company men, doesn't matter. The moment an artist puts pencil to paper, he is a de facto co-creator. Period. But good luck finding those who agree with me. But I created it to be a manifesto on purpose because I know a little bit about art history. The Surrealist movement was created by a poet, André Breton, a French poet, not an artist. And what did he do? He wrote manifestos. There are these 2 famous Surrealist manifestos. The counterculture movement started at Berkeley called the Free Speech Movement because Mario Savant, whatever his name is, Savant, Savant, whatever his name was, he wrote a document with Tom, what was his name? The husband of Jane Fonda eventually, Tom Hayden.
Tom Hayden, yeah.
Right. My point is, great movements in history, art or otherwise, have been fomented by written manifestos. And I tried to do that with my auteur theory of comics. And maybe I'll be proven right, when I'm long gone. They'll say, hey, this guy Arlen Schumer, he had it right. And nobody believed him. And he was blackballed and he paid the price. Curt Flood was the first guy to stand up for free agency in baseball. Thanks to him, every baseball player gets to write his own ticket. He got blackballed. And by the way, he happened to be black. Gee. Huh. In a white-controlled sport, every baseball owner, you don't think they punish Curt Flood for making now owners have to pay their players more than they ever wanted to? Mickey Mantle went on the record as saying, if we had free agency back in the day, during the great years of the Yankees, there'd be no great years of the Yankees because none of those players would have been on the Yankees. They would have left for more money. So my point is that I don't mean to cry in my beer and I don't even drink alcohol. I'm just saying factually, I've paid the price. But has it stopped me? Am I still talking about it? Because I believe I'll be proven right eventually, maybe. But if not, who cares? It's part of my career, for better or for worse.
When you travel, obviously in the last few years, I would think that the sort of acceptance of Kirby as a co-creator has shifted. No?
What if I told you I just came from another podcast in which two guys who profess to know and love Kirby, through our discussion, I was able to kind of, how Columbo, by asking questions, would suss out a guy that pretending to be innocent and then would reveal his guilt?
Yeah.
I was able to suss out from these two guys, who were friends of mine, their Stan Lee bias. You know how many people who claim to love Kirby instinctively give Lee not only co-creator credit, but sole credit on things? Here's this guy saying, Kirby didn't bring back Captain America in '64 because a couple issues before, he appeared in Strange Tales written by Stan Lee. Now, from what I know of the history, and I tend to believe Kirby, not Lee, Kirby creates Captain America because of the death of Kennedy. And the timing works out. And it was Kirby. Captain America was Kirby's character.
From Timely.
Right? And with Joe Simon. But the point is there is forensic evidence of Kirby in the late 50s seeing what DC was doing with the revival of their superheroes from the 40s. Pester, Goodman, and Lee. Bring back Marvel's heroes. We own the Human Torch. We own these guys. Let's do what National is doing, as they called DC then. And of course, it finally took Goodman till 1961, when the Justice League of America finally was making big money because it teamed all those rebooted characters together. And they finally say, okay, let's do it. Now, it's the same thing. So I say to my friend, who drew that Strange Tales story that you claim Stan Lee wrote, and in a sense, it was his idea to bring back Captain America? Oh, Jack Kirby drew it. Oh, really? Gee, every story Jack Kirby, quote, drew, he also, quote, wrote. And what I mean by wrote, when you draw a comic story out in silent pictures like a silent movie, you are, quote, writing the story. Artists like James Romberger, who is a real theoretician of comics history, will tell you, and other artists have said this, when you're an artist of a comic story, whether you're given a full script or not, you have to be a movie director. You've got to be a lighting director. You got to be a choreographer. You have to be an actor to draw those things and make them real and convincing. And I don't mean real like realism. I mean make it real to the reader. A screenplay is only words on paper until a director figures out how to make it into a movie. You give the screenplay of Ed Wood to Orson Welles, you're going to get a different movie than the movie Ed Wood directed from the same script. You follow me?
Yeah.
It's no different with comic art. So I said to my friend, and he professes to love Kirby and giving Kirby credit. And here he is in his own mind admitting that he thinks Stan Lee brought back Captain America. And I said, isn't it disgusting that a guy who co-created Captain America is doubted over bringing back Captain America in favor of the guy that didn't create anything? And that's the art crime of the 20th century that I'm talking about. So even a guy that claims to be an historian, that claims to love Kirby, and if he's listening, Jim Thompson, I'm talking about you. And I love Jim. But this was stunning to me. And that means that if an educated comic historian is still bending over backwards, unconsciously or consciously, to give Lee creative credit, think about all the uneducated historian comic fans out there that automatically give Lee the creative credit. Mm-hmm. And that's the art crime of the 20th century.
Have you ever spoken to Stan Lee personally about this?
Yes. And the funny thing is, Team Lee is playing the zero-sum game. They want Lee to claim all creative credit, which Lee himself claims. But they think us on Team Kirby want to do the same thing, that we want to give Kirby all the credit and give Lee nothing. I, in my own auteur theory of comics, say, listen, this is not to say Lee is not the rightful co-creator of Marvel Comics itself, meaning he gave us the voice of the characters through his edit. Even though he didn't write the stories, in my opinion, backed up by the forensic evidence, the act of writing dialogue, even if Kirby did margin notes telling Lee what the characters were saying, by doing that, you've given the characters a voice. Ergo, I begrudgingly give Lee a certain amount of co-creative credit via his dialogue, which is the voice of the character, his editorial voice. That's what everybody knows and loves and remembers about Marvel Comics. Stan's soapbox, hey, true believer, face front, which he was doing as his homage to EC Comics. Mm-hmm. EC developed first that camaraderie with the reader. Lee took it one step further. And God bless him. Was he a good editor? Yeah, I think so. He made some bad art direction decisions because he also was the art director. But the point is, as I think I said before, the term Marvel Comics, imagine that in all capital letters. I believe Kirby and Ditko et al. Created the comics themselves. Stan Lee created the Marvel, meaning the voice, the spirit, through his dialogue writing. Now, sometimes it could get obnoxious, but that was his shtick. So you'd have incredible Kirby page of a Captain America fight scene. 9 panels, unbelievable what he would do, choreographing this scene like a ballet. In his own words, by the way. He said that's what he was doing. No words needed, but what did Stan Lee have to write? A whole disclaimer box above the artwork. A whole paragraph. Hey, true believer, normally I step in and say something, but you know, Jolly Jack did such a great job on this page. Don't you agree? Now, some people love that. That's what they remember from reading Marvel Comics when they were kids. A lot of us look back on that now as Kirby fans and like, thanks, Stan. You had to stick your nose in. We couldn't just enjoy. You know, sometimes saying nothing is saying a lot. Jim Steranko left Marvel Comics in 1970 because he was tired of fighting with Lee over, you know, there was that famous sequence in Shield 1 in 68. Totally silent for 3 pages. When Steranko brings in the pages and wants to get paid, I believe it wasn't Lee, it was Sal Brodsky, the production manager. Why should I pay you for writing? There's no words.
Got it.
But Steranko, the point is Lee and his minions are not happy with that 50% credit for the success of Marvel Comics via his dialogue, editing, and promotion. That's not enough. They want it all. And Lee wants it all. And he's lied in print and on the stand. Do you know laymen think he's also the artist? I've talked to enough laymen. They don't know the name Jack Kirby. Here we are at the San Diego Comic-Con, which is the house that Jack built. Good luck asking anybody walking the floor if they know who Jack Kirby is. But guess what? They know Stan Lee is. Mm-hmm. And laymen think, oh yeah, isn't he the artist? There was an art exhibit in London a couple of years ago. It was called Marvel Posters. So think about that. Posters of the Marvel characters. So it's all about the art. Guess who the gallery said it was created by? Guess who all those Londoners seeing the exhibit thought did the posters? Didn't they once say to somebody, do I have to say his name? Was that about Elvis?
I don't remember. I wasn't born yet.
I know, but I'm just saying. Hey, don't rub it in. Listen, you're not my younger brother. I'm probably old enough to be your father. But go on. Anyway, have I made my point?
Yes, you have. Let's talk about, you mentioned Elvis. Let's talk about Bruce Springsteen, because I know you love him very much.
Yes. The superhero of rock and roll. It's just to relate it to comics. You know, like Shazam, he's got the powers of Solomon and Hercules and all that.
Yeah.
It's funny you mention Elvis. And just, you're asking me about Bruce Springsteen, just for the people listening. I was art director of his first fan magazine 40 years ago when I was at Rhode Island School of Design. And if you go to my website, I've got a dedicated poster site, popcultureman.com, where you can see the art that I did when I was 20 years old in 78 that was actually used for one of his legendary concerts and some other things. So my take on Bruce is that, and as what I know of rock and roll history, there are, I believe, 4 pillars of rock and roll history. It starts with Elvis, the first white boy to rock that took black, blah, blah, blah. The singular presence of Elvis, that's a pillar of rock and roll. Then you get, chronologically, Bob Dylan, the guy that brought lyrics, meaningful lyrics to rock and roll and legitimized it as an art form via his lyrics. Then come the Beatles, the greatest band, that positive, uplifting spirit that they brought to the music. And then the last guy is Jimi Hendrix, because of the electric guitar as the singular rock and roll object. Bruce is not one of the 4 pillars of rock and roll. Obviously, chronologically, he comes after. He's a kid when all that's happening. But I believe Bruce is the pillar, the roof built over those 4 pillars, meaning he has a little bit of all 4. Now, nobody thinks of Bruce as a guitar hero. He relegated that to Steve Van Zandt. But Bruce back in the day was a guitar hero. And listen to September 19th, 1978, and you want to hear Bruce channeling Hendrix, there it is. And Patti Scialfa talks about, people forget that Bruce was known in his early days as a hot guitar player. But he wanted to be the complete entertainer as he got older and wiser. And he kind of relinquished that. He brought in Steve Van Zandt. But every now and then, Bruce can show you what he can do in the electric guitar. But, you know, Rolling Stone, Guitar Magazine, they've had their polls. Greatest living guitarist. Top 100. Guess where Bruce placed?
Top 20.
Nope. Higher.
Really? Top 10?
No, meaning towards 100.
Oh, towards 100. Top 60.
Nope. Keep going.
80.
Nope. Higher.
100.
Didn't even place. My point is, he wanted to be, they called him the new Dylan. Guess what? There were a bunch of new Dylans. The only one who became a new Dylan is Bruce. He's got the lyrical power and the reputation, just his career from a critical point of view. There's nobody who's been as critically successful and popularly successful as Bruce. Most people have been one or the other. Dylan never had the record sales or the concert things that Bruce has had, but he was respected. Mm-hmm. And plenty of people have had the success of Bruce, sold out stadiums, right? But they don't have the critical reputation. Bruce has both. And that's something that only the greatest artists achieve. Steven Spielberg, for instance, critically accepted. Okay, there's critics that think, he's too mainstream, but that's why he did Schindler's List, which put everybody in their place.
Right.
My point is that to be popularly and critically successful equally is very uncommon. So My feeling is, and when I say Bruce is a superhero of rock and roll, because he's got elements of the four great pillars. His band, the E Street Band, if you've seen him in concert, gives you that uplifting, positive energy that if you remember nobody saw the Beatles except a handful of people in retrospect. But what you remember the Beatles, what you see when you see those old films, that energy you've gotten at a Bruce concert, that positive, uplifting energy. And the singular presence of Bruce. It's not a band like the Rolling. Okay, Mick Jagger's a singular presence, but Bruce's singular presence as a guy that can both sing and write and perform and play guitar and lead a band. And then Bruce's greatest achievement is what people have been saying about him since he started. The reason why Landau's manager, when he was a critic, wrote in 1974, I've seen the future of rock and roll, and it is Bruce Springsteen. And that came true. You know, the only boast like that is when Joe Namath in the third Super Bowl said to a disbelieving sports writer audience, oh yeah, we're 17 underdogs. We're going to win. Now, whether Namath said that just to talk about thinking positive,
Yeah.
who knows? But you know what? If you were 17-point underdogs and you wanted to win the game, you should say that. Act as if. And guess what? They beat the Colts. Nobody has made a claim like John Landau made for Bruce Springsteen in the 20th century. And guess what? It came true. The album Nebraska created the alt-country movement. That one album. You ask anybody that's involved in what they call alt-country, they'll say Nebraska is their foundation stone. But what Bruce did in the very beginning that made him who he is that there used to be a fourth wall between a performer and an audience. In any live show, whether it's a ballet, a Broadway play, there was always a barrier. Now, Bertolt Brecht talked about breaking the fourth wall. So every now and then, they talk about when a performer on stage, usually a live thing, all of a sudden talks to the audience. That's called breaking the fourth wall. But every live performance before Bruce, let's just say in rock and roll, there was always a wall between the audience. It became cool not to perform to the audience. You know, in the early 70s, it was all the slumped over, cigarette dangling, back to the audience. It was all about the music, man. Performing was like old school. Like that was the Sinatra. You know what? Bruce shattered that fourth wall into 1,000 pieces. And when you read early reviews of Bruce, they might not say that, but that's what they're describing. When people see Bruce for the first time now, like on Broadway, they've never seen a performer that literally breaks that fourth wall and comes out to you physically as well as literally. You know, nowadays it's kind of groovy. All performers now go into their audience.
Right.
Bruce was doing that when nobody was doing that. Because back then, thanks to Tommy by The Who, and things like, you know, what's his name from The Doors, and all
Jim
the,
Morrison.
you know, Police used to be on stage. No rock and roll performer, ever since, you know, Altamont and a guy getting murdered. No performer went into the audience in the early 70s. What did Bruce do? He jumped right in. And Clarence came with him and sang right from the audience. Now, kind of everybody does that. Back then. But that was Bruce physically shattering the fourth wall. But if you've never seen Bruce, I'm assuming.
I haven't.
Okay. He's 69 years old, but again, McCartney's 77. Whether they'll do another E Street Band, and you already missed Clarence, so when Clarence used to step up to play a solo back in the day, it was like bottom of the ninth inning of the seventh game of the World Series when the home team is losing. It's like Casey at the bat not striking out. Every solo, that's how I can only describe the rush from the crowd. Now, his nephew, Jake Clemens, God bless him, is playing sax. There'll never be another Clarence. But you can see Bruce on video from 1978 at his prime at this September 19th concert that I just gave a lecture to a 40th anniversary Bruce symposium. And I maintain that's the greatest single show, and I was in the 6th row.
Wow.
And my point is you look at that video that exists. You know, Bob Dylan's greatest show, the Royal Albert Hall in 66, there's no video documentation of. But thanks to John Scher, the promoter, we have the greatest rock and roll live document captured on black and white video. And if the aliens landed right now in front of us and said we have room on our spaceship, we've heard about this Bruce Springsteen, what are you going to give them? I'm giving them that videotape. And everybody listening, go on YouTube, look up that date, Bruce Springsteen, Capitol Theater, Passaic, New Jersey. He's like a living live wire. Nobody like him. He's the greatest. He is the king. I know they call Elvis the king, but I believe when the final history... Listen, when Bruce goes, that's the end of rock and roll as we know it. Rock and roll will mutate, but the original rock and roll of which Bruce is the second wave, he represents authentic rock and roll. And when he's done, and I believe he'll be on his deathbed strumming the guitar in a hospital, and we'll all be in the observatory watching as he Look, Ditko died at the drawing board. They didn't discover him for 2 days. It's probably how they're going to find me, I think. But I believe that's how Bruce is going to go. And once he goes, that's it for 20th century rock and roll.
Is there anybody that you see that's
taking his place?
Yeah.
No.
I mean, not.
There's great bands.
Yeah.
There's great performers. I mean, I see a lot of young bands. Listen to the radio station WFUV coming out of Fordham, New York, 90.7. You can get it on the internet. They play everybody. Classic songs and new music. Bands like, you know, Mumford & Sons and Brandy Carlisle and you name it. They don't play pop music. They don't play rap. But they play authentic rock and roll. And a lot of bands, a lot of performers, you know. But there's nobody like Bruce. But you've got to see him to believe him. And the point is when he's gone, people are going to say in the future, did you see Bruce Springsteen? Because he will go down in history as the greatest rock and roller ever. He is. He's a living legend. And he's still doing it. Did you see his performance on the Grammys? Okay, go. I'll take that as a no.
No.
Google it.
Okay.
Because he does a part of his Broadway show. It was unbelievable. Here it was, this mainstream Grammys where nobody wants to talk about anything serious. Okay, De Niro comes on and says, fuck Trump. Right? But then what does Bruce do? He does this harrowing. Well, it doesn't begin as harrowing. He does this just piano and voice monologue about what it was like to grow up in New Jersey in the early 60s and what he witnessed and his family and the mental illness. And it turns into this harrowing indictment of America and American society and the way things were. And he doesn't pull any punches. And it was mesmerizing. There's nobody like that. The only person doing that in another medium is Howard Stern. In terms of getting in the public and being real. Who can you say that of? It's a short list. There's Howard Stern and Bruce Springsteen, and then I can't think of who else. You tell me.
I'm a big Joe Rogan fan.
Okay. Is he really real? Is what he presents real? Or how much? Listen, what Bruce presents, part of it is obviously an act, but it's an act based on reality. And enough people have met Bruce off stage. There is no other Bruce Springsteen.
Sure.
I met Bruce Springsteen in 1978 after that great show that I did the artwork for the marquee that you can buy a poster of on popcultureman.com. You like the way I snuck that in? The point is I presented that original art to Bruce. I'm 20 years old. At the height of my Bruce's God, you know, not that that's changed, but... And Bruce signs it. And then I say to him, I look him right in the eye. And I said, Bruce, and I had read interviews with him before I went to meet him. I knew what rock and roll meant to him. He grew up in a white trash, uneducated family. And rock and roll brought him culture and a life. I wanted to say something to Bruce that somehow got across what he did for my life and by extension, everybody else at that show. And I said, Bruce, your music means more to me than anything else in the world. Now, I've been quizzing people on this for 40 years. How do you think he responded to that? We were surrounded by about a dozen fans and John Landau, his manager, who personally introduced me to Bruce. There's somebody I want you to meet because I did the artwork. So imagine a dozen fans, some of my friends that came with me to the show and a bunch of strangers. Bruce is drenched in sweat. And I'm about 5'8". Bruce is actually about 5'8" too, but on stage, you look bigger. How do you think he responded to that? And I looked him right in the eyes, this far away, 6 inches. And there was a flash of communication when I said those words right to him. He got it. Now, how do you think he responded?
He probably just gave you a hug.
How did you know that? Did I already tell you that?
No.
Thanks a lot. You're like a heckler. You just ruined my whole... You're supposed to say, gee, shook your hand. What most people say for 40 years. Can we edit that out? You're supposed to say, gee, I don't know, Arlen. What?
The only reason I say that is because that's something that I would probably do.
Okay, because you're a real man. and you've got a soul. The reason why I quiz people is that everybody assumes... And by the way, only women usually get the hug. You're one of the rare men, and I'll tell you why. Because you are a creative person. You've got a sensitive soul. What I said to Bruce was as real and honest as I could make it. And given Bruce's reputation as being real and honest, he could have patted... Most people, when I quiz them for 40 years, oh, he shook your hand. Oh, he said thanks. And I say, no, he never even said a word. What do you mean he didn't say a word? Didn't say a word. He didn't shake your hand? No. Didn't pat you on the back? Nope. But you said he gave you a reaction. I said, yeah. But it wasn't verbal. But then what did he do? I said, he gave me a brotherly hug, like a bear hug. And like the Brian De Palma films where the couples are in embrace and the camera, like from Hitchcock, circles around? That famous cinematic thing where the couple's in love and the camera's circling around? You're supposed to look at me like you know what I'm talking about.
I'm trying to.
But do you know what I'm talking about? That famous camera move?
Yeah.
Where the couple is still, but the camera's like moving around them. It's a classic. Hitchcock did it and Brian De Palma did it. That's how I felt. It was a total bromantic kind of moment. But I remember the dozen fans, when they saw that, they let out some kind of sound. I don't know whether they clapped because I'm in my Brian De Palma reverie. They either clapped or they let out. But in other words, I said to Bruce what every fan wants to say, but either doesn't articulate. Bruce, I love you, man. Or Bruce, sign my thing. Or Bruce, you were great. Whatever they say. I said to Bruce what everybody is thinking. But I had the kind of courage. And even though I must have had a grin from ear to ear, like I was ready at that point to meet Bruce. Mm-hmm. And I felt like this was my chance to say something as real to him as he's been saying to us in his music and in his few interviews. So he gave me the Zen perfect response, which only a handful of women in 40 years and you have guessed. And I wonder how many people listening guessed that he gave me a brotherly hug. And that said to me, when I told you, I sensed that flash of communication in his eyes. His only response had to have been a hug. And I haven't washed my body since. That's that smell. No, but my point is, I can almost get teary-eyed when I talk about it because I remember it, obviously, like yesterday. And in a sense, I've been recounting that story. And, if you remember the movie Fahrenheit 451, the Bradbury story, the future where they're burning books. At the end of the movie, and I'm assuming I never read the book, but at the end of the story, they've succeeded in burning all the books. But there's a group of people that memorize the books, and they become living books. Mm-hmm. I have become a living representative of September 1978 because I was there. The video even though it's in raw black and white, that's what the show looked like. Even though I saw it full color live, that video is more real than I've seen every film and video Bruce has made. There is nothing like September 1978. God bless John Scher. And by the way, 2 years ago, John Scher was given an honorary something in Asbury Park for his commitment to the arts through his promotion. He's still promoting Monarch Entertainment. I haven't seen John Scher since that show.
Oh, wow.
And I saw him, and there's a picture, and, I brought the original art. John Scher, God bless him, in 78, pre-video era, pre-MTV. Back then, people forget. There weren't video screens at concerts. I'll never forget walking into the Capitol and seeing two square, not rectangle, square white screens on the side of the stage. And I was like, what are those? I had seen a bunch of live shows before Bruce. I saw Elton John. I saw Jethro Tull, Rod Stewart. My point is, video in the late 70s was just coming in. But thanks to John Scher being prescient, we have the great rock and roll document that, again, I would give to the aliens as not only the greatest example of Bruce, but this is rock and roll in its purest form. And maybe that's a good way. And by the way, like I said, I have connected Bruce as a superhero because the magazine Backstreets, the Bruce magazine since 1980, I've been a contributor to. And in 1994, for the 10th anniversary of Born in the USA, I got to do a wraparound cover illustration of Bruce as Captain America. The whole Born in the USA thing, But in my article about the cover inside the issue, I talk about the black and white Capitol Theater image that I created for the Darkness era, which was about black and white. But the Born in the USA, when I sat down and I talked about Bruce is the superhero of rock and roll, and this kind of brings our conversation about Bruce full circle, because I started to say he's got, like Captain Marvel, the powers of all these previous rock and rollers rolled into one. Ergo, he's like the superhero of rock and roll.
He's like he's the Shazam of rock and roll.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. He's like Captain. He's Captain. He's the superhero of rock and roll because he's got all the powers of all the individual gods in one person. Nobody else has that combination. Nobody.
Mm-hmm. Now, we were talking a little bit earlier before the podcast, and another thing I admire about you is that you don't rest on your laurels and you try to learn new things, and you're...
Not really.
Well, you are...
Really? I like the way you think about me because I'm a 20th century dinosaur. I got left behind in the computer age because I couldn't get the computer graphics thing.
But you said you're going for your MFA right now?
Yes, I am. Well, a little late in life, better late than never. But yeah, it's because all the years I should have been teaching, I was making a living as an illustrator, and I was in a bad marriage, and I got a lot of pressure to make money. And believe it or not, the School of Visual Arts wanted me to teach in '92, and I blew it. I kind of let that opportunity go, and I look back at it now like, how can I have let that go? If I had been teaching at School of Visual Arts since '92, I'd be the head of the department by now. But coulda, woulda, shoulda, and when the brass ring comes around, I let that one go. I can easily blame it on my ex-wife because of the pressure. She didn't want me going into New York City teaching instead of being home making money. Mm-hmm. There's a great Twilight Zone episode, speaking of another one of my great loves, which I've done a lecture called Comic Books on the Twilight Zone, because so many of those Twilight Zone episodes are like the EC science fiction horror stories with those surprise endings, which they took from O. Henry. Mm. But Serling read comics. He was in World War II. All the servicemen read comics. And Serling read science fiction, and I'm sure he read those EC comics. But there's a great episode, Willoughby, one of the classics. And what's Willoughby about? A sensitive, creative guy living in Westport, Connecticut, commuting into New York City, and has a shrew of a materialistic wife that only loves him, quote, loves him, because he's making a big advertising salary. Now, Serling was commuting into the city in the 50s, living in Westport, Connecticut, before he went out to LA to do the Twilight Zone. And I did a project. It's on my website. There's a Twilight Zone icon at arlenschumer.com. You click on that, a bunch of my Twilight Zone projects will come down. One is called Westport in the Twilight Zone. because I believe some of the greatest episodes, like the Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which is all about the dark underbelly of suburbia, The Shelter. There's a handful of episodes that come across to me like these were Serling's experiences living in Westport, Connecticut in the mid-50s, in the era of The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which is a famous movie in the 50s about, the corporate man and blah, 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 which was the beginning of the post-war consciousness that led to the beatniks and eventually to the hippies, rejecting materialistic American society. Anyway, in that episode, Willoughby, to all those Twilight Zone fans listening, he fantasizes that he goes to Willoughby while he's on the train going back and forth from the city like Sterling was. And what is Willoughby? This Edenic, bucolic, 1890s, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, with the gazebo. This was Serling reminiscing about his childhood in Binghamton growing up, which he always returned to in many episodes. He was very nostalgic for his childhood, more than normal or usual, but he wrote great episodes out of that. Mm-hmm. Walking Distance is another great Twilight Zone episode that's totally about that. But in Willoughby, which is the sister episode to Walking Distance, basically he keeps waking up and he's back on the train in the winter. But he fantasizes he's in Willoughby in the summer. But he doesn't get off the train. But he keeps coming home to the materialistic wife because at work he can't hack it. He can't take the pressure. And his wife only wants him to keep the job, and he can't take it anymore. And even though he was on the account side, the whole point of it was he was a sensitive soul. And what happens at the end? He finally says, the next time I daydream in Willoughby, I'm going to get off the train. And the final dream sequence is he does. He gets off the train and walks off with, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer to go fishing. All of a sudden, the camera cuts, and we see him dead on the ground in the snow. Because, during the episode, it took place in the winter.
Right.
But every time he went to Willoughby, it was the summer. And the conductor's standing there with the cop. What happened? And the conductor goes, I don't know. He got up, yelled something about Willoughby, and jumped off the train and killed himself. Here I am, a Twilight Zone fan. I did a coffee table book. I end up moving to Westport, the town where Serling lived. I'm married to a materialistic shrew of a wife for 19 years that only loved me, quote unquote, for the money that we were making. And as artists, we had a loft in New York City, doing storyboards and comps that I learned from Neil Adams. Mm-hmm. But the point is I jumped off that train. Except unlike the guy from Willoughby who succeeded, I failed. Or maybe, given the way my life's gone, maybe I succeeded and this is all hell.
Well, we did talk earlier this morning, or before the podcast, and like you were seeing doppelgangers of people that you saw might have known here in Comic-Con.
Oh yeah, but the point I want to make is, here I was a Twilight Zone fan.
Yeah.
And as I was living and literally dying this episode, I wasn't even aware of it. That's how deep in my pain I was. That I didn't even step back and say, Arlen, you're living this Twilight Zone episode. Get out.
Right.
So that just shows you. I don't know what the point was. What the point is.
Well, the point is that you're starting to move in that direction where you should have been before with your MFA.
Yeah. So back to that. So here we are late in life. I woke up one day. Print is dead. Illustration's dead. There's very few venues for printed illustration. I didn't like the Industrial Revolution. There were people left behind. I didn't learn the computer like I should have, so I couldn't really compete. And then, so basically here I am in my later years, so to speak, even though I've got more energy and passion than men a third my age. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping that'll keep me, quote, young, but I'm a natural teacher and my lectures are a form of teaching, but coulda, woulda, shoulda. So I woke up one day and I'm like, what the hell am I going to do as I get older? Illustration's barely a hobby, even though I'm a member of the Society of Illustrators, and my work is better than it's ever been. You go to popcultureman.com and you'll see my artwork there. But I'm just saying I'm not as busy as I should be, but nobody is because print is dead. So the point is I just said, I should be teaching. But because I don't have years of teaching experience, I have syllabi written up for how to teach the Twilight Zone, comic book history. Everything I do, I can teach. I'm doing a project about the Superman Fleischer cartoons. I can teach those. So the point is they'll only listen, and they're not teaching these things. So I believe the powers that be in education will only, in a sense, listen to me if I have those letters after my name. I've been told that when there are teaching positions up, the administrators that are in charge of admissions, they get the pile of resumes and they separate them into two piles. The ones without the higher degree go into the garbage. So my point is, there's no guarantee. It's funny. I'm talking to a woman. I live above a retail store in Westport, Connecticut. And I'm talking to the woman. It's a woodworking place that they create those jungle gyms that every suburban family has in their backyard. And it's called Walpole Woodworking. So I'm talking to the woman who, works there every day running the joint. And maybe she's in her mid-50s. And I'm telling her I'm going to the MFA and my goals and dreams. And I say, listen, I'm under no illusions that once I get my MFA in 2019, all of a sudden doors are going to fling open. But maybe they will. Who knows? Think positive. So you know what her answer was? Arlen, I have my PhD. She's working on Walpole Woodworking, and I have my PhD. Am I getting too close to the mic?
No, that's fine.
Okay. So that was a little sobering. But the bottom line is, I am. If anybody that's seen my lectures listening to this knows, nobody lectures about comics like I do. Nobody lectures about Bruce Springsteen like I do, or the Twilight Zone like I do. And all my stuff is on YouTube, my YouTube channel. Anybody can see. I'm not just talking out of my ass. I know I'm good. And two of my last lectures at San Diego Comic-Con were rated the best panels at the convention by, a guy that's been reviewing San Diego for 25 years. I recently almost got a job, and I said, how did you know me? Oh, Arlen, we were looking for great speakers about comics, and your two, top 10, like I was rated number 1, came up. I'm like, gee, finally. I get something out of being rated number 1. God forbid, do you think any other conventions called me to invite me to lecture after I was rated best 2 years in a row?
Guess not.
Yeah. My phone never rang once after that. But okay, that's life. But like I said, I am the best at what I do, and I know it. And the only way a man can talk like this is if he can back up his bullshit. Therefore, it isn't bullshit.
Right.
Bruce Springsteen, had to live being told he was the future of rock and roll. And he delivered. Great people back up their bullshit. Ergo, it's not bullshit. Muhammad Ali, he backed up his bullshit. Mm-hmm. Except when he fought Joe Frazier. As great as Ali, the greatest, I'll always remember he lost that bout. People forget because obviously if they weren't there, that 1971 bout, the first time he fought Joe Frazier.
Is that when he got his jaw broken? Or
no, that came later with
okay.
Ken Norton, I believe.
Oh, okay.
No, but this was the end of his comeback. Had he beaten Joe Frazier, it would have completed his comeback after, when he said he wasn't going to go to the Vietnam War in 1967. He was banned from boxing.
Got it.
So he came back, I think starting in 1969. He starts fighting it. It all built to the Joe Frazier fight. And it was Madison Square Garden, closed circuit TV, pre-cable. But he lost that fight. And even though he ended up winning other championships, I can never call him the greatest. Because when he had to be the greatest, he lost that fight. And even though he beat Joe Frazier in later fights, there was nothing ever like that fight. That fight was the big kahuna. And I don't know how you can be called the greatest if you've lost such a major bout as that. Doesn't mean he wasn't great. And I could care less about boxing. I think it's an insane sport. How they dare call it the sweet science is beyond me. It's two people beating the shit out of each other until one collapses. I love football. It's pretty violent.
Yeah.
But it's a game where there's objectives and, there's strategy and this and that. People aren't just running at each other to kill each other. There's gymnastics and ballet. Now, boxing fans might claim, oh, but there's a type of ballet. Yeah, right. It's two guys who can beat the shit out of one another. You know what I didn't like about the Black Panther film? To bring us full circle back to the Black Panther? Let me get this straight. A highly evolved technological society that's also supposed to be so elevated, spiritually. They pick their leader based on who can beat the shit out of each other? Think about that.
Yeah.
They pick their leader based on a purely physical contest. And as a white person watching this, I'm thinking to myself, isn't this racist? If you know about the Civil War era and slavery, and if you saw Django Unchained, white plantation owners used to make their big Negro men fight each other to the death. That wasn't made up by Tarantino. That was based on reality for the entertainment of the white people. Mm-hmm. And you mean to tell me a black movie in 2018, directed by a black man, is going to say we choose our leader based on who can beat the shit out of each other? Explain that to me. I found that to be shocking and really like I said, racist and pointless and sending the wrong message. The black community is all about, how do we get kids out of the ghetto and the gangs and all that. And, the blacks that made it out of the ghetto, they were ridiculed for acting white. If you were smart in school, you were acting white. And I'm just a white kid from New Jersey. What do I know? I just know what I perceive from history and the media. But all of my heroes were white who fought for black people. Rod Serling cast the first black actor in a dramatic TV show in a 1960 Twilight episode. Ivan Dixon plays a boxer before Muhammad Ali appears. And he's later the black guy in Hogan's Heroes. Famous mid-60s TV show. That was Serling. EC Comics, also two Jews, Gaines and Feldstein, create that famous story at the very end of the EC era called Judgment Day. Do you know this story? It's a famous EC science fiction story drawn by Joe Orlando. It's all about a spaceman from the Federation of Planets, a la Star Trek, who comes to this planet of robots. And the planet is applying for Federation joining. So this guy is sent to investigate. And he notices the blue robots think they're superior to the orange robots. And they kind of enslave the orange robots. Now, the whole time the story's taking place, the guy from Earth, he's from Earth, sent to investigate this planet for the Federation. We don't see it. He's in a space mask, a space helmet. That's kind of with a darkened visor, so we don't see him. You know where the story's going? Think about what we're talking about. Where do you think the story's going? This is in the early 50s, before the Civil Rights era. Written by two Jews. By the way, Bill Gaines' real name, Ginsberg. And I do a whole lecture, Jews and Comics, which is on my my YouTube channel. The guy that created the comic book was Bill Gaines' father. The idea of folding pages down and stapling it, that's his father, MC Gaines, a.k.a. Ginsberg, changed his name. I digress. But guys like the comic book creators who were Jewish in the early 60s, whether it was Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, they were trying to get black people into comics. Jack Kirby, a.k.a. Yaakov Kurtzberg, creates the first black superhero. Not a black man. Well, they didn't probably allow... There was a couple black people in comics. That famous, I always forget his name, black comic artist. Now I'm going to seem like a lousy historian. I can't remember his name. Racist. Because he was black, right? I forget his name. But a famous, one black guy that drew comics in the 50s, maybe. And maybe there was a black woman. But the point is like most industries in the early 60s, there were no black people there. Except in step and fetch it roles. But Serling casts the first black actor in a dramatic role. All the pop culture I grew up in the 60s, mostly created by Jews, tried to help black people. And Jewish people, like I said, were the philanthropists behind the civil rights movement. And the fact that there's so much black anti-Semitism out there today breaks my heart. And it just shows you that a lot of black people don't know their history. There's a famous Jewish lawyer that got assassinated, Allard Lowenstein, that helped the black cause and was shot by a white racist. You don't hear about that, do you?
No.
But he was instrumental in the early civil rights movement, helping it from a legal perspective. So all of my heroes, I remember the first time Diane Carroll was in this TV show called Julia in 1967 or so, the first time a black actress. So all the pop culture I grew up with. Do you know the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, the famous Will Smith?
Yes.
You know, that's based on a real story about a black kid in trouble in Philly that goes to Beverly Hills and is raised by a white family, wealthy, to get him out of the ghetto. And the guy's name ended up selling the idea as the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But they made one minor change in the reality. Guess what the change was?
It wasn't a white family.
Yeah. And it wasn't a white Jewish family that took in a black kid from Philadelphia. So the three guys that died in Mississippi in 1964, working for the civil rights movement.
Like the
One was a
Bernie
black
movie?
guy, Don Chaney. I think his name was Don Chaney. And there were two white Jews, Schwerner and Goodman. Now, this doesn't mean only Jews helped the blacks, but I'm just saying there was a major Jewish presence in the civil rights movement. So I think Kirby was aware of that as a Jew who fought in World War II and was aware of Jewish history and the plight. And like a lot of Jews in the early 60s said, what can we do to help black people? And that's why we have the Black Panther. But the fact that the average black comic fan, does he know that forget about Yaakov Kurtzberg. Do they know that Jack Kirby? No, Stan Lee created him. So when I do my lecture, I would love to lecture to an entire black audience because I find the full mask of the Black Panther, as cool as it looks, is as racist as that Ku Klux Klan hood. And you don't think that upsets black people to hear that? But I'm only doing that to stir the pot. But look at how we're protesting mascots for sports teams that are now considered racist. The Redskins is racist. Look at that grinning Indian for the Cleveland Indians with the buck teeth. Do you know they won the World Series a couple of years ago with that mascot?
Right.
Okay. They're protesting those. I find it ironic that the Black Panther is only fully masked because of racism. Now, if you notice in the movie, every second the mask is off. I think deep inside they're aware of that, but I just still find it racist that his creator did not intend him to be fully masked. And if we really want to honor Jack Kirby, the Black Panther should never be wearing a mask. Too late now, though. Everybody loves it, right? It's cool. Look, Iron Man has a mask, Spider-Man. Mm-hmm. That's not the point. He's only masked for racist reasons. So I just want to create the conversation. But like when I gave the lecture, I debuted it in White Plains a couple months ago. And White Plains has a big black population, so there were a lot of black people in the audience. But I wanted that. And sure enough, when I got to the end and I dissolve an image of the Black Panther mask right over the Ku Klux Klan hood, and I say, they're both racist. One is, in favor of white supremacy, and the other is, let's keep a black man in his place. We don't want a black superhero. Okay, if you got to have them, liberals, you better put a mask on them. But again, so black guy in the audience afterwards, immediately, hey, I don't know what you did at the end. Are you saying the Black Panther is racist? I'm like, no. I'm merely saying we have to recognize history. He was never intended to be fully masked, and he's only fully masked because he's black. Bottom line is, occupy Black Panther. Demand that he in honor of Jack Kirby's original creation and in honor of our enlightened post-racial society, I'm basically saying, and I'm doing this with tongue half in cheek in the sense of just to create the conversation.
Right.
And maybe through my podcast and my lectures, LA is going to see it. San Diego is going to see it tomorrow. And like I said, I'm just the mischievous imp stirring the pot, but I like that role. You know, it's funny. I tell people I don't make fun of comics, but I have fun with comics. That's two different things. And, you know, I used to wear a Superman cape, which I got stolen at the Palm Springs Comic Con. That's a whole other story.
Yeah.
But the point is, you know, I've been, he's the guy that wears a cape and, you know, you can't take him seriously. And maybe it has hurt me. I don't know. But for better or for worse, it's gone. But, you know, that's me having fun with comics, not making fun of comics. I'll never make fun of comics because they gave me my life. Mm-hmm. Everything I learned from about art, I learned from comics. The morals and the lessons, everything. I didn't have a father, but I learned everything about right and wrong, good and evil, how to stand up for what you believe in. All these moral things about black people are equal. Neil Adams drew that great black man in 1970, the first really realistic drawing of a black man since I didn't finish the EC story because I asked you. Finally, the Earthman says to the blue robots, sorry, we can't let you in because you're oppressing the orange robots. They're no different than you. They're robots, but only their color's different. Mm-hmm. He goes back in a spaceship to go back to Earth, takes off his helmet, and he's a black man. This is 1954. There are no blacks in American pop culture, in comics or the movies, unless they're Hattie McDaniel or Stepin Fetchit or whatever. But yet two Jewish guys put him in a comic book in the early 50s. And Joe Orlando obviously worked from photo reference because that drawing of a black man in the final panel of that story is too realistic for him to draw out of his head. Mm-hmm. Flash forward 16 years later in 1970, and in the first issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, where it starts out where Green Lantern is flying over a tenement area of the city, and he sees a businessman being physically harassed by a bunch of hoodlum, young toughs. So, of course, Green Lantern swoops down, saves the day. The businessman thanks him. And then he hears somebody yell, "Hey, superhero." And he turns, "No need to thank me, or, people." Typical DC superhero.
Right.
And he gets tunked on the head by a can of beans. And that's the actual sound effect, tunk. Mm. Who's it thrown by? Green Arrow. Who proceeds to tell Green Lantern, "Hey, you idiot, that was a slumlord trying to evict those tenants." And he goes, "Hey, Green Lantern, you want to see the tenement they were living in?" And thanks to the realism of Neil Adams, we get to see the inside of a New York tenement as only Neil Adams can draw it. Rats and all. So we feel that. And then we go up to the roof. And Green Arrow starts to say to Green Lantern, "You got to wake up and smell the coffee," about the real world. Which basically is Adams and O'Neill, the writers, saying to all of the DC superheroes from the 60s, you've been flying around. So a black man is on the roof. And he goes up to Green Lantern and says, "Hey, Green Lantern, I heard about you, how you saved the orange-skinned people on one planet, and you saved the purple-skinned people on another planet." And then Adams draws a panel, a close-up of this black man shot from below, which looks photographically realistic like his art did. But according to Adams himself, that was out of his head. He goes, "I would have craved for a photograph like that." That's the art. It's the first realistic drawing of a black man in close-up. And he says, "But there's one skins you never helped, the black skins. I want to know, Green Lantern, how come? Answer me that." And in the third panel, shot from overhead, because it's like directing a movie. Green Lantern bows his head and says, "I can't." That's one of the groundbreak. It's in my book. That's one of the groundbreaking sequences.
I remember reading that in the book, yeah.
But the point is I forget what, I need a script girl. Like in movies, I go off on so many tangents. Like, how did we get there? And what was my overall arching point? I learned about so many things that you're supposed to learn from school and church and your family. What's that famous book years ago? Everything I Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Everything I needed to learn and know, I learned from the great comics and the great writers and artists that created them for little money. Mm-hmm. It was never about the money. How they made livings is beyond me. I guess it was volume. That's why they churned it out. But I can still recall a Superman story from 1965. I was 7 years old or something. And it was called Superman Tells the Truth or something like The Day Superman Told the Truth. And it's your typical Mort Weisinger, Kurt Swan story, 12 pages. And what's it about? Why do I remember it to this day? One of 1,000 Superman stories I must have read as a kid. Why do I remember that one? It starts out where Superman and Supergirl are all over Metropolis doing various things, and everywhere they go, they're telling the truth, but like the bitter truth. So Supergirl is at a Girl Scouts function. They make her fried chicken. And she tastes and she goes, "This is the worst fried chicken I've ever had." And she flies off and the girls are in tears. Jimmy Olsen signals Superman with his signal watch. And Superman says, "You know what, Jimmy? You're a pain in my fucking ass." Now, he doesn't say that. But he says, "Jimmy, I am sick and tired of you calling me every 2 seconds because I gave you that signal watch." And he flies off, and Jimmy Olsen's in tears. And this goes on for a few pages. And everybody wants to know, why are Superman and Supergirl doing this? Where they're, quote, telling the truth, but in a way that hurts people.
Right.
But they're being, like, bitterly honest about everything. Sure enough, and it's only a 12-page story, at the end of the story, Superman and Supergirl at the end of the day meet up in the Fortress of Solitude. And they proceed to tell the reader, so to speak, even though they're talking to each other, why they were telling the truth. And they flash back. They're honoring a Kryptonian holiday. And what is the holiday? It's a holiday where you tell the truth no matter what. And what are they honoring? And they tell this through flashback. Thousands of years ago on Krypton or whatever it was, an alien race comes and enslaves Krypton in chains. And only one Kryptonian stands up and denounces the alien race as assholes, basically. And of course, they kill him. But by killing him, they martyr him. And the rest of Krypton rises up and overcomes the enemy race. And what was the guy's name that stood up? And this is classic Mort Weisinger era Superman. You know how they're all Kal-El, hyphen? His name was Val-Or.
Valor.
Okay, now think about that. Why do I remember that story? Probably more than any other Superman story I read, and I read hundreds of them. Oh, man, you're failing the test. Come on, man. What was the story about?
Well,
why were they honoring Val-Or?
Because he stood up.
Yeah. Against death. He told the truth. He wasn't going to be submissive. He got up and said, "I'm never going to listen to you alien overlords. Fuck you. Fuck your planet. Fuck you forever. I'll never submit." That's what we learned from Spartacus. Remember? Mm-hmm. I'm Spartacus. No, I'm Spartacus. They all were willing to die. Now, I do a lecture called Christ and Comics. It's not on my YouTube channel because I never got a videotape. I did it a few years ago. It's all about the Christological aspect of superheroes. For Jor-El so loved the earth, he gave his only begotten son with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Superman, created by Jews, just like Christ, looking for a hero to come down and save us. That's a Jewish idea that came together with Christ. And what did Christ do? He died for our sins. He sacrificed himself. He gave himself up to the Romans. That was a form of love to defeat hate. It took 325 years, but the Roman Empire became Christian. Mm-hmm. He overturned the Roman Empire. You know, a famous Roman emperor, as he was dying, I think it was right before Constantine converted or something, because there were so many Christians in the Roman Empire. And he, at his dying breath, said, like, "You win, Galilean," referring to Christ. So all the superheroes are Christ-like in the sense of, what are they doing? They're protecting the people they love with their superpowers, but they also sacrifice themselves for the ones they love. And where did I learn that? Like a whole generation did, from all those comics we read. You know, there was a great Batman story, and they're not even drawn by great artists. Bob Brown, one of my least favorite artists, drew one of the greatest Batman stories, written by Bob Kanigher, who usually wrote war comics. Mm-hmm. It was called Die Small, Die Big, 1969. Track it down on the internet and read it. That's one of the great stories. And why? Because the guy sacrificed his life for Batman in a Christological way. Christ said the greatest thing a man can do for his fellow man is what? This is testing your New Testament. I'll take that as a no. You know, by the way, you failed every test. He said the greatest thing a man can do is lay down his life for his friends. How many we were talking today on another podcast. What is the most remembered story of Tower Comics that Wally Wood did? It was mostly the art was decent because Wood had his hand in it, but none of the stories are memorable. Ask anybody if they could remember a single Tower Thunder Agent story. Good luck. But what is the one story they remember? There was a character called Menthor. He looked like the Atom. Some mind device, whatever. He had a mind device. I don't know, some bullshit. But what do we remember? We remember the story, the death of Menthor, when he again sacrifices his life. We remember that. Mm-hmm. I remember the story, the death of Superman, 1960. I read it in a reprint in 1968. I'm 10 years old, sitting in my grandmother's apartment in the Bronx. And Superman is killed by Lex Luthor, and at the end, Supergirl carries on. And there's a final panel, beautifully drawn as usual by Kurt Swan, where Supergirl's flying in the sky and she sees in the clouds, again, typical Weisinger motif, the ghostly image of Superman waving. And there's a tear dripping from Supergirl's face, and she goes, "Even though I'm now taking my cousin's place and, you know, helping the world, I'll never forget my cousin Superman." And I'm 10 years old, and I remember the tears dripping on the comic book page. Now, we talk about, in a negative connotative way, oh, it's a tearjerker. You know, if something is trite, if somebody is kind of pulling at your heartstrings, that's considered trite and like too easy. But let me tell you something. Getting an audience to cry from a two-dimensional, lifeless paper medium, good luck. Good luck.
Right.
Every story I remember from my comic book past has to do with a character dying or a character crying. Neil Adams did a great Batman story, one of his Brave and Bold team-ups, 1969, with the Teen Titans. And in the end, a bad kid ends up redeeming himself and does something good, and he sacrifices his life, Christologically. And there's Neil Adams drawing Batman crying. Now, a tear is dripping through a mask with an opaque white eye. This wasn't like today where they expose the eyes of Batman, which drives me nuts. And they add the black mascara. Don't get me started. Batman's got white eyes like Spider-Man. Neil Adams drew a tear coming out of Batman's white masked eye in his realistic way. Go read that story and tell me if that image and that story doesn't move you, whether it moves you to tears or just touches you. Mm-hmm. That's a lot harder than making a film of that with real people acting. We were talking today, you know, There are some great artists that have done a lot of comics, but I don't remember any of the stories that they wrote and drew, because while they might have been good artistically, in the end, a great story can save bad art. One of my favorite Batman stories is drawn by Ross Andru, who, other than the Metal Man, I hate. The most awkward figure drawer in comics, along with Frank Robbins. Both, by the way, have legions of fans. But of all the Batman stories that I can recall from my childhood, the number one Batman story is drawn by Ross Andru. So what does that tell you? I love the art. I'm an artist because of comic book art. But what do we remember? We remember the play's the thing, like Shakespeare said. It's the story. And when you've got a great story and great art, like the Neil Adams stories, then you really remember those. But some of my favorite stories of comics history do not have, quote, great art. Mm-hmm. So a great story is what it's all about. So there are some great artists in comic history. I don't want to name them because otherwise I'll have to edit this podcast. But there's like a great creator whose artwork I love, who's done a lot of comics. And if I told you his name, which I will off camera, you'll know who I'm talking about. I love his art, but I can't recall a single story. Why? Because he didn't write a single story that touched me emotionally or really made me think afterwards. Like I can't recall what went on in a single story by this creator. And he's turned out a lot of comics. And he's a great artist.
Right.
But I couldn't name you one story. I couldn't recollect. Even though I read them all and bought them all off the newsstand, I couldn't recall it the way I'm recalling these other stories drawn by Bob Brown and Ross Andru. So again, what does that tell you?
It's all about the story.
Do you know why Pixar is so successful?
Because they make me cry.
No, but why do they make you cry? Based on what we've just been talking about. If you've read about how they create those movies, they spend years on the story before a single image is drawn. Now think about what I just said. They spend years on the story, which means everything we're talking about, they work out. And then they illustrate it with state-of-the-art, technology and creativity. But why do we remember those Pixar movies? Why are they so successful? There's a girl in my MFA class, her whole life is because of The Little Mermaid. Because all of those, Toy Story is all about the story.
Right.
And the feelings, it's all about what do we want people to feel. And I wish more comic artists would think about that. But every medium, in music, it's about getting people to hear a song and feel the emotion. In movies, in all art, it's about getting people to feel something. And all the great pop culture that I grew up with, Twilight Zone, comics, Sean Connery bombed. I had no father. The first movie my mother took me to, God bless her, may she rest in peace, was Dr. No in a drive-in theater, and I'm like 5 years old with no father.
Right.
You don't think I'm looking at Connery like as the ultimate father figure? But Serling was one of my father figures. I ended up working for Neil Adams, who's 17 years older than me, could be my father. I treated him like a father figure. Mm-hmm. Bruce Springsteen's a father figure. He's only 9 years older than me. I found my father figures in pop culture, which, works and doesn't work at the same time because they're real, but they're not real. Although Bruce Springsteen, unlike Sean Connery, he ain't playing a role. Connery played Bond. Bruce Springsteen is the real deal. Mm-hmm. When they say who is the man? Who is the man? Right now in society, I'm going to ask you, Aaron, who is the man? And what does that mean when I say who is the man?
It's pretty much, I would think, somebody who's well, the connotation that I gather is the forces that are keeping you from progressing.
You're not answering the question. Who is the man? Oh, wait a second. I don't mean the man like the man keeping us down.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. I should clarify this. I mean, when I say who is the man.
Oh, I see. You okay.
Who is somebody that you can look at and say,
right.
That is the meaning. He is a man, meaning what does that really mean to be a man? And I don't mean a macho man. I mean, what does it mean to be a great man? So when you look out in society now, who is the man? I'll say it's Bruce Springsteen. I believe Bruce Springsteen is the real president of the United States. And I wrote this in the year 2000 before he became politically involved because I saw this in him, but we all did. Bruce is living his life by example with integrity, and for all the money that he's made and the fame and the success, he didn't let that get to him. He's a role model as a creative person who fought the record companies, who wanted to, after his first 2 albums that didn't sell, they were going to let him go. Mm-hmm. And they said, Bruce, write us a hit single and maybe we'll keep your contract. So what does he do? Oh, he writes this little song, maybe you've heard of it, Born to Run, which I believe is the greatest piece of recorded music in history, which I know people listening, oh, that's blasphemous. I maintain Born to Run, the song, is the greatest piece. It's the greatest piece of recorded rock and roll. And I've written a big essay on this. My point is, that's what I mean. He's the man. How many are there like him out there right now? Good luck. Mm-hmm. We used to think of our politicians as the men. They're our leaders. Bruce has done more to lead this country through his fans who cross all spectrums of society, from scientists to laborers and everybody in between. And I believe he's touched people worldwide. There are books about this. Do you know there's a book about how Bruce Springsteen, by playing East Berlin in 1988, brought down the Berlin Wall and is not given credit?
Interesting.
People talk about how Paul McCartney playing in Russia in the 80s helped foment what eventually brought down the communist regime, because the spirit of rock and roll was about freedom. Mm-hmm. And they had to smuggle in Beatles records in Russia and Poland and all those Eastern Bloc nations. But people have written about when Bruce Springsteen played East Berlin and talked about freedom within his music and did a song, what he was playing at the time. Bruce's music is all about, poor men want to be rich, rich men want to be king, and a king ain't satisfied till he rules everything. I believe in a promised land. Bruce has been a leader in his music, and according to East Berliners, that concert so affected the people who saw it, and it was an outdoor concert at the Berlin Wall. So however many hundreds of thousands there were, a year later, the Berlin Wall comes down. And Bruce never seems to get the credit, but there's a book about it. So when I say Bruce is the man, I mean good luck finding another man who's done what he's done in his career. Never lost his integrity, never sold out. Do you know there's not a single commercial with Bruce's music? But the Rolling Stones sold out, the Who sold out. Everybody else is sold out. Mm-hmm. And even the concept of selling out is an old 60s ideal. Everybody has sold out except Bruce. In 1985, Lee Iacocca wanted to use Born in the USA for a Chrysler campaign. He went to Bruce, offered him $15 million. Bruce said no. What does he do? They hire a sound-alike and they do a campaign called Born in America. With a singer, Born in America.
You can't even say it.
I can't, But my point is, Bruce is living the ideals of the 60s. He's got a song that he did when he was 21, right at the dawn of the 70s. And the lyrics are all about, it's an acoustic song, and it's all about, he's saying to the counterculture that died at the end of the 60s after Kent State, Nixon crushed the counterculture.
Mm-hmm.
He basically said to the counterculture, I'm going to carry the torch. And he's 21 years old saying this. And he made it happen. He did carry the torch. Up until he died, the partnership of Bruce and Clarence, a white man and a black man in pop culture, lasting that long, good luck finding a comparison. Only Howard Stern and Robin Quivers are the only other pop culture, and they're both gender mixed and racially mixed. But Bruce, in giving Clarence what he called a soul kiss, was proclaiming to the audience, rock and roll is all about white men and black men working together to create music. And Bruce demonstrated on the stage. That's what I mean about leading through your art. Bruce lived it, he performed it, and he meant it. And that's why he's got a legion of fans worldwide. I'm not the only one that would tell you this.
Mm-hmm.
And Bruce fans listening to this know exactly what I'm talking about. But you see, you haven't seen him. And forget about all you've seen of him. Until you've experienced that guy live, you have not experienced a live show of any. I overhype Bruce to newbies. I tell them, think of the greatest live performance of any type you've seen. Broadway show, about whatever it is. When you see Bruce Springsteen, you will see live performance as you've never seen it before. And any Bruce fan that's seen him, that's listening, is nodding their head right now. Except you, because like a lot of people, you haven't seen him. Or people think he's only the guy that screams Born USA because, that's the way it is. But listen, you brought this up, not me.
Well, I was curious.
But I'm saying
I wanted to learn more about it.
Well, like I said, it's like having children. I have 3 children, metaphorically, that I love equally, that are relatable to each other. Twilight Zone, comics, and Bruce Springsteen. And depending on the venue and what the subject is, I love all of them equally. But I've related all of them. Twilight Zone and Bruce Springsteen, how are they related? Oh, thank you for asking. I just asked myself the question.
Right.
But I'm segueing to it. Because you might know, how can I relate Twilight Zone with Bruce Springsteen? So, in 1981, Bruce is doing a benefit for the Vietnam vets. This is before Billy Joel does his song, Goodnight Saigon. According to the head of the Vietnam vets, without Bruce Springsteen, there would have been no successful Vietnam vets program. Bruce saved the Vietnam Veterans Organization by talking about it and doing that concert in 81. And it was broadcast at the time. He had all the Vietnam vets in wheelchairs lined up at the front of the stage. And he goes out and opens up with a monologue. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing, he goes, Vietnam for America was like a dark street. And there's an alleyway. And we walk down that street, but we don't want to look in that alleyway because it's dark and scary. But there are people in that alleyway hurting and dying. And if we don't look in that alleyway, we will never get home again. Now, I'm listening to this at home on the radio. All I can imagine is Rod Serling. That sounds like a Rod. Vietnam was like a long, dark street. And if we don't look in the faces of the men and women in those shadows, we will never get home. We will forever be trapped in the Twilight Zone. Now, Bruce grew up on the Twilight Zone. He's written lines like, it's a long, dark highway and a thin white line connecting your heart to mine. I think Bruce got his dramatic metaphors totally from Serling. You watch those Twilight Zone introductions and they're masterpieces of introductions. Mm-hmm. Those, I mean, we make, everybody does their Serling impression. I just did mine.
That was pretty good.
But you know what I mean? I've actually done stand-up years and years ago, and one of my routines was, everybody can imitate Rod Serling, but I'm going to give you Rod Serling doing Bruce Springsteen. So I'm wearing a black suit. I got the cigarette, the spotlight. I go, in the day we sweated out on the streets of a runaway American dream. At night we ride through mansions of glory and suicide machines. Baby, this town rips the bones from your back. It's a death trap. We've got to get out while we're young, because tramps like us, baby, we were born to run into the Twilight Zone. So my point is, you know, I think Bruce got a lot of his dramatic metaphors and his style of writing tight lines. I wouldn't be surprised if he got it from Serling. But so all I'm saying is, hearing that Vietnam monologue made me think that. Mm-hmm. And then it's funny, I'm doing a project about the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons.
I was going to segue to that
eventually. And that's one of my MFA projects, and maybe I'll get it published. But I got the great animation historian, Jerry Beck, to commit to writing the introduction. There's never been anything scholarly written in depth about the cartoons. So if this book happens, it'll be the definitive book on the Fleischer cartoons. And I treat the cartoons like comics, so that you get to read them like comics while you appreciate the great art. And anybody that's seen those cartoons knows what I'm talking about. And my belief is everybody loves these Superman Fleischer cartoons if they've been exposed to them. Certainly my generation, we grew up seeing them on television on our local stations at weird hours of the day or night. But you ask everybody from Steven Spielberg to George Lucas, you mention the Superman Fleischer cartoons, everybody loves them. And yet, there's not a book about them. Even in History's Animation, when they talk about the Fleischer Studios, they always talk about Popeye and Betty Boop. Superman is barely discussed. And I'm thinking, why is this? He's Superman. It's not some esoteric subject. But I think there's a bias, because in animation history, they love funny animals. Most of Disney is funny animals. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a bias towards realism in animation, especially the realistic figure. Because all of the great animations are not realistic figures. Disney, you know, Fleischer did Popeye and Betty Boop, and you name it. And it's only in the modern era with things like Akira do you get realistic figures again. But I believe there's an animation history bias against praising the Superman cartoons, because it's a superhero and it's realistic, you know. But you ask anybody that knows those cartoons and knows animation. I mean, Bruce Timm's Batman animated series is a total homage.
Right.
Frank Miller dedicated the first Dark Knight, if you remember, to the Fleischers, Supermans, because he was doing Batman in the style of how he saw the Fleischer Supermans. Dark Gotham City. Metropolis, as portrayed by the Fleischers, was this dark New York. Superman, like Batman, barely says a word. So Miller does The Dark Knight in homage. Mm-hmm. So, getting back to Bruce Springsteen, believe it or not, I'm watching a documentary about 6 months ago made by the BBC, because Bruce is doing his autobiography. He's on Broadway now. So it was all about Bruce reminiscing in front of the camera about his childhood. Now, he grew up in New Jersey. I grew up in North Jersey. He was in Central South Jersey. But we grew up with the same media, the New York media, which had the network stations and also 3 local stations. Unlike the rest of the country, which maybe got the 3 networks and had 1 local station. So people that grew up in my era, we grew up with the Three Stooges and the Little Rascals, the Universal monster movies that a lot of the country did not get. So I'm watching Bruce. He goes, you know, when I was a kid, I had an older sibling who passed away when she was like 5. And, you know, in families, whenever that happens, they treat the second child like the golden child. They give them free reign because they don't want anything to happen to them. So Bruce said, they let me stay up late at night. And I remember right before the test pattern came on, they used to show these Superman cartoons. Now imagine, I'm working on the Superman project with the belief that everybody loves these cartoons. And there's my hero talking. Now, he didn't say the Fleischer cartoons, but I know exactly. I remember staying up late at night because my mother was easygoing and let me and my brother stay up when everybody else was going to bed at 9 o'clock. I remember those cartoons late at night.
Right.
So how great is that? And I immediately emailed Jerry Beck this story, and I said, Jerry, you can use this in a blurb. Even Bruce Springsteen loves the Max Fleischer Superman cartoons. So you see what I mean about all of my loves all relate, whether it's me reading into it, but it's all based on reality. Bruce is the superhero of rock and roll. He shares a writing style with Serling. Serling knew comics. The episodes are like the EC comics. You know, that's my life. Those are my 3 children.
It's incredible how you sort of intertwined the lessons that, you know, come together from those 3 things that you love.
Yeah. And I know Bruce read comics because in some of his songs, you know, there's a song called I'm a Rocker from his River album. And it's all about, I got a Batmobile and I got a 007 watch. Mm-hmm. It's Bruce dropping. In one of his earliest songs, he talks about, she looks like Marilyn Monroe and walks like Smokey Stover. Now, they used to animate Smokey Stover in the late 50s. It was on TV along with Popeye or something. So Bruce knows his American pop culture. I bet you read comics, you know, watched the Twilight Zone, you know. So yeah, it does all intertwine. And like I said, it's not me reading into it. I'm going by what I call the forensic evidence.
Now, your panel, I guess we can start going back to Black Panther.
It's not really a panel because people think a panel means
visual lecture.
No, but you know what I'm saying? People mostly at panels, it means multiple people talking about the subject.
Uh-huh. So going to your visual lecture that you'll be presenting tomorrow at Comic-Con, Black Panther. I mean, what do you expect the audience will get out of it?
You know, that's a good question. And it makes me think because I don't know if the creator or the presenter is responsible for that. All a creator can do is put it out there. You know, songwriters talk about, you know, I write a song and it means something to me. And then you put it out there and it affects people and people come back and tell me what the song meant to them. And I had no intention of that, but that's the power of art. Now, you know, what I hope they get, I hope they love the subject and love me presenting and get turned on and get educated. You know, I have a couple of great memories the last couple of years. One lecture I was giving, I was running late or something, and the other presenter needed to come in, and they asked something like, I forget what happened, but somebody, the audience didn't want to leave. And I'll never forget it. Like a teenage girl raised her hand, and she goes, I've learned more in these 45 minutes about comics history than I ever learned in my whole life. I was doing a lecture about Jack Kirby a year ago in California, San Diego Comic Fest.
Yes.
Not Comic-Con. And it was on Kirby and, you know, the 100th anniversary of his birth. And I must have touched on this Christological aspect because the greatest Kirby by consensus, everybody talks about Fantastic Four 51, this man, this monster. Now, I don't know if you know that famous story. It's in my Silver Age book. I talk about that. It's considered by consensus maybe the single greatest Marvel comic story of the Silver Age. Mm-hmm. And it's all about a villain who turns himself into a copy of the Thing because he wants to kill the Fantastic Four. So he transforms himself into a thing. And somehow, I don't know, either he knocks out the Thing, somehow he's able to get into the Baxter building and blah, blah, blah. And to make a long story short, obviously, in the end, during the story, he sees Reed Richards Christologically sacrificing his life for the rest because he's trapped in the negative zone. And he's going to sacrifice himself for the other members of the Fantastic Four. And think about what we've been talking about and why this story has affected people. And they consider it the single best story of the Marvel Age. And in the end, the villain thinks, you know, it redeems him. He witnesses the sacrifice, the Christological sacrifice of Reed Richards. And that makes him not only reform, but it makes him sacrifice himself to save Reed Richards. And at the end, if you know about the negative zone, if you're trapped in it, you get sucked into the center where you'll die. And the last 3 panels, with Stan Lee dialogue, but it's Kirby's story. Even though it says written by Stan Lee and people think it's his story.
Right.
It's Kirby's story. And the dialogue at the end, it's funny, a writer is preparing an obituary for Lee. A lot of writers employed in journalism, they prepare obituaries ahead of time for people that are on death's door. So he asked me, he goes, Arlen, I know how much you don't like Stan Lee for what he did, but I got to write his obituary. Can you find it? Like, I love your writing. I know can you say something positive about Lee? And I said, listen, I give him 50, I get into my spiel. I give him 50% credit, but that's not enough. But I did write about his dialogue. And I used this Fantastic Four story because at the very end, in 3 panels drawn by Kirby, as he gets smaller and smaller into the center of the negative zone, he's on a rock. He goes, and I'm paraphrasing just from my memory, but it's basically something like, I learned something today. And I learned what it means, like to be a friend or something. Because it was remember, the greatest thing a man can do is lay down his life for his friends.
Right.
And he kills him. He sacrificed his life. Again, people remember that. It was a one and done story. Please tell me why I brought that up, because once again, I forget. What was my original point in bringing that up? Is there somebody out there that's been taking notes that can call in now and remind? No, but you know what I mean? I brought that up for a reason. What were we talking about? What did you ask?
Well, we're trying to tie in the panel tomorrow.
Right. Oh, you said, see, this is good. You said, what do you want people to get? So I'm talking about that story in my Kirby Centennial lecture last year at San Diego Comic Fest. And that story is a highlight because it's considered the greatest single story. And Kirby Centennial, you have to feature his greatest story, right? A young guy comes up to me about your age. And
25? I'm joking.
You're not getting older, you're getting better. And he comes up to me and he goes, Arlen, when you talked about the Christological aspect of the superheroes, you brought a tear to my eye. Because, and again, I'm paraphrasing, because I've always felt that, but I've never articulated it like you did. And we've become friends. And, he's a believer in Christ. So that's also why he goes, Arlen, and the fact that you even talked about Christ within comics. But I said, listen, I do a lecture on Christ in comics, which I probably mentioned in the lecture when I brought it up. Just like when I talk about the great Jews, that I say, listen, I do a lecture on Jews in comics. That's what you hope will happen when I lecture. But it's no different than any teacher or any performer. If you only reach one person in a crowd, whether it's in a classroom of 30, you've succeeded. Now, ideally, like you said, what do you hope? You hope all 30 people in the class get it. But you talk to teachers, and I guarantee you they'll tell you. Most of the students, they're not going to learn. They're not going to get it. But all you really hope is one person gets it. Why? Because one person can change the world.
One person can tell they're 30 or however many.
But my point is, if all you can do is touch one person, that's successful. Mm-hmm. That's all you need to do. Getting back to Bruce Springsteen, he talks about his performing style. And I'm sure a lot of performers do this. He says, I usually find one person in the audience that looks like they're really getting it. And I perform the whole show for them. Even though he's jumping around the stage, looking at the crowd, I know what he means. When I'm lecturing, I look out at the audience. I can see who's nodding off or doing their cell phone or whatever. But I try to find somebody, man or woman, that I can tell is getting me. My passion, my energy, the visual, everything. And I basically lecture to them. Even though I make sure I'm, communicating to the whole audience. And that's, you hope to touch somebody in a real, meaningful way. And it makes all the other problems of your life and the tech failures. I can't tell you how many lectures I've done.
I've been to a few.
Yeah. It makes all of that frustration. The fact that I usually don't get paid for any of these lectures. Every now and then I do. I need an agent. Anybody listening, I need an agent to represent me. Let's make money together. I'm the greatest lecturer. I need an agent to book me. Okay? All agents out there, get on it. The best way you can thank me is find me an agent.
I'll do my best.
But my point is, all the frustrations. You think I'm getting paid for this in San Diego or LA? No. It's all freebie. But I do it because I love it, and career-wise, like I have to do it to keep up the semblance of a so-called career. Mm-hmm. And but I love it. I enjoy it. I would do it for nothing, and I do it for nothing. But for all the frustration and blah blah blah, yeah, when you touch somebody and you've reached them and you've changed their life, in a sense, mm-hmm. Talk about paying it forward. But that's what my mentors and the people I love did for me, sitting in that audience. Now, Bruce Springsteen did it for more than one person. That's why he's got worldwide fans now, because he did that and more than one person in the audience got it. Pretty much everybody got it. My greatest memory of a Bruce Springsteen concert was the very first time I saw him, the very first time he headlined Madison Square Garden 40 years ago. Next month. I'm on the floor. In those days, there were chairs on the floor. There was no pit. And every Bruce fan, mostly male, this was before he really got a female crowd, mm-hmm. Mostly guys my age. We're too young to have been affected by Dylan. We were the age, my generation is a little bit of a lost generation. People talk about the generation after me, Generation X. People talk about the generation before me, which is the 60s generation. Nobody really talks about my generation because we're like in the middle. My point is that my greatest memory of Bruce is that in the year 1978, which was disco, Saturday Night Fever, right? The Rolling Stones were doing Miss You. And no offense against people that like disco, but if you're a rock and roller, disco was not rock and roll.
All right.
And that's not to say there weren't some disco. Listen, I've grown to actually like Miss You by the Rolling Stones. I like that funky bass line. But in the middle of disco's heyday, if you stepped into an arena in 1978, and the people that listening that saw him back then know exactly what I'm talking about, we felt like there was only one place in the world where real rock and roll was being played in 1978. And that was inside a Bruce Springsteen concert. And I remember being on the floor, standing on my chair. Now imagine a whole floor audience, not only standing through the whole concert, standing on their chairs through the whole concert. The whole floor. Nobody went to the bathroom. When Bruce talked, you can hear a pin drop. Mm-hmm. During moments of the concert, strangers, and again, it was all men, strangers in the aisles, they left their seats. They were hugging each other because we couldn't believe the greatness that we were experiencing. Because the moment we stepped outside, it was do.
Right.
Now, I'm almost getting tears in my eyes because I can remember that feeling of strangers hugging each other out of the pure joy of what we were experiencing in the moment. Now, if you've never experienced that in your life, that's a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. And that made us lifelong fans. And that's why Bruce has they talk about Bruce now. Critics will say, Bruce's audience is aging baby boomers and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, why are we aging? Because Bruce never let us down. He wasn't like Elvis Presley who burnt out and died. He didn't go glam on us. He didn't drug out. He kept his commitment to us from the very beginning and never let us down. Never failed us. And that's why he's got an audience of aging baby boomers, because we've aged with him. And we've kept our end of the commitment. Nobody's talked about Bruce like we're talking about him right now. You can't go online and find anybody talking about him with the passion and the realness that I'm telling you this. I know because I'm a Bruce fan. I see what's out there.
Right.
But that is my specialty, is that I can articulate and also show the real love, because everything comes down to love. All of these artists, Rod Serling, The Twilight Zone was always over budget and never had high ratings. Star Trek was going to be canceled after the second season. You know, people wrote in letters. It was like the equivalent of a viral campaign. And that's why there's a third season of Star Trek. Did you know that?
I may have come across that article.
I'll take that as a no. Anyway, like I said, you failed every test so far. You know, I always joke, I should teach a course called Remedial Media. Remedial Media. And your generation should attend it, in which I basically show them every fucking thing that they've missed. You know, the 60s were a turbulent decade. Assassinations, Vietnam War. But man, the pop culture was off the charts. Need I go into why? And not that the 70s or 80s or 90s don't have great shit. Mm-hmm. But come on, man. There's nothing like the 60s. That's why we're still reliving them. That's why acts like the Black Keys, why are they loved and revered and do well? Because Dan Auerbach knows his rock and roll history. And if you know your rock and roll history, you can tell where he's getting those licks from. Mm-hmm. They're from classic rock from the 60s and 70s. So in the things that I love that touched me as a child, I try to recontextualize as new art, whether it's graphic design or my presentations. Albert Camus had a quote that a friend of mine, an artist friend, gave me like 15 years ago and said, Arlen, this quote is you. And it ends my Silver Age book. I have a one-page auto bio of like growing up with comics and, you know, what made me love comics. And the quote by Albert Camus, famous existentialist author, and I can recite this obviously from heart because I've been saying it for 15 years. And it really gets to the heart of what I've been trying to say just now. A man's work is nothing but the slow trek to rediscover through the detours of art those 2 or 3 great and simple images in whose presence his heart first opened. Mic drop, as they say.
That's it. That's the show.
I mean, is that the show? That's the show.
The show.
I mean, do you have enough, I think?
That's enough, man.
No, but was that the show?
That's the show.
I love you.
I love you too. Thanks for being on the show, Arlen.
Listen, I can tell just by the way you listen to me. You got it. You're the one person that all I need to, you know what I said? You know what I mean? It doesn't matter if the audience doesn't get it. I know you got it. Well, who am I performing to? You're the only one here. But you know what I mean? I saw the look in your eyes. I know you got it. And you know what? That means the people listening, they're going to get it. How do I monetize this? Okay, enough about you. I'm helping you. What are you going to do to help me?
Help you find a good agent.
Yeah. Get me an agent. God damn it.